Let me tell you something the chronicles refuse to whisper aloud. When Viking longships carved through the mist, it wasn't just peasants who trembled. Thrones shook, crowns fell, queens and princesses, symbols of dynasties, were dragged from gilded halls into the shadows of long. And here is the secret: the scribes buried. Their fates were darker, stranger, and far more powerful than we were ever taught. Some became slaves, some became sacrifices, and some unbelievably became mothers of kingdoms that rose from the ashes of invasion. You were never meant to know this truth, but tonight we walk into the silence of forgotten halls and tear away the veil. The year was 845. Paris trembled as Ragnar Lothbrok's fleet surged up the Seine, black sails slicing the river like blades. The chronicles tell us of fire, ransom, and the terror of King Charles the Bald. But what they do not say is who watched from behind shuttered windows, who wept in candlelit chapels as the Norse broke the city's defenses. Among those silent figures were queens, duchesses, and noble-born women, symbols of kingdoms, who suddenly found themselves pawns in a war of blood and ambition. Can you imagine the silence of a royal chamber as the echo of war drums drew nearer? A princess, her gown trailing across marble floors, clutching a relic of Saint Denis, as though its holy power might hold back the axe. Outside, the chanting grew louder, shields clashing like thunder, and then the door splintered. What the annals conceal, sagas hint at. Captured noblewomen were not merely prizes of war, they were bargaining chips, living ransoms, or offerings to Norse gods. Some were paraded like trophies, their crowns stripped from their heads as warriors sang of Odin's victory. Others vanished into longhouses, their names erased, their fates swallowed by silence. But silence itself is a clue, because when women of royal blood vanish from history, their absence is deliberate. Do you think the scribes simply forgot? Or were their stories too shameful, too dangerous? Take the case of Princess Melkorka, remembered in Icelandic sagas, not as a royal, but as a thrall, a slave girl who spoke no tongue. Only later did whispers reveal she was the daughter of an Irish king. Imagine that, a princess veiled in silence, forced to bear children for the very men who destroyed her father's throne. What would you have done if you were her? Scream, resist, or play the role of silence until survival itself became power? Every candle in a medieval chapel flickered with rumors. Queens carried into exile, princesses married against their will to Viking jarls, noblewomen who chose death rather than dishonor, and yet others found in captivity a terrifying kind of agency. For in the North, bloodlines mattered. To claim a queen, even by force, was to claim legitimacy, to forge alliances through wombs as much as through swords. Picture this: a queen seated by the hearth of a Viking hall, her face lit by the orange glow of fire. Once she commanded servants, armies, priests. Now she is silent, her fate unwritten. Yet in her silence lies prophecy. For the child she carries may one day command fleets, write sagas, bend kingdoms. Do you see the irony? The same men who stripped her crown could not strip her womb of power. The recurring motif here: the crown is more than gold, it is survival. Queens lost their crowns to fire, but some planted invisible crowns on the heads of their children, crowns that would rise generations later. The annals remain silent, but blood remembers, and blood tells us what ink cannot. If you had stood in those longhouses, heard the whispers in foreign tongues, smelled the smoke and sweat, what would you have done? Would you have resisted and died nameless, or lived in silence, carrying within you the seed of revenge disguised as lineage? The chronicle closes here with silence, but our story does not. For what happened to these women did not end with captivity. It spiraled outward into betrayals, forbidden rituals, and legacies that reshaped the medieval world. And so we step into chapter 2, where their silence becomes prophesying. Prophecy demands blood. Imagine a hall heavy with smoke, the air thick with mead and sweat, the long tables echoing with laughter of men who had just sacked a kingdom. At the edge of the firelight, a woman sits cloaked in silence. Her crown is gone, her jewels stripped, her title erased. Yet every eye that glances her way knows what she truly is: a queen, a princess, a vessel of power no less dangerous than the swords that lay across the benches. This is where the chronicles turn quiet, but the sagas whisper in fragments. They tell us of noble-born women carried across seas, their identities hidden, their bloodlines traded like silver. But there is something the Vikings believed that made these women more than spoils: fate. And fate, to the Norse, was inescapable. Consider the Seirses, the Vavlor, who drift through sagas like ghosts in woolen cloaks. They whispered that the children of queens, even in captivity, carried prophecy. To birth a royal child even under chains was to plant the seed of future kings. Is it any wonder, then, that some captive queens were guarded more carefully than treasure, not for their sake, but for the lineage that grew inside them? Picture a Viking hall in the winter of 866, the great heathen army marching through Northumbria. Among the captives is a young princess, her belly swollen with child. The jarls debate her fate. To kill her is to erase a bloodline, but to keep her alive is to risk birthing a rival. And yet, prophecy hangs over her like smoke. What if this unborn child is fated to lead armies greater than theirs? What if Odin himself has marked it? These were not idle fears. In a world where omens ruled, a raven flying overhead or the crack of thunder could sway the decision between life and death. A single prophecy could save a queen or condemn her to ritual sacrifice. And here lies the cruel twist. Queens and princesses often became pawns in rituals meant to secure victory. The temple at Uppsala, the chronicles say, reeked with blood sacrifices of animals and men. Yet archaeology hints that women, too, were offered, sometimes noble-born, sometimes chosen because their bloodline was considered sacred. To sacrifice a queen was not just an act of brutality. It was to bind her blood to the gods, to force her lineage into service of Odin. But not all were sacrificed. Some, like the Irish princess Melkorka, vanished into anonymity, enslaved yet secretly remembered. Others adapted, learning the Norse tongue, weaving themselves into the fabric of Viking households. Here, survival itself became strategy. A silent queen at the hearth, watching, waiting, whispering to her children in a tongue the Norse could not understand. Can you imagine the defiance? To teach your son words of kingship in secret, knowing that one day he might rise and claim both thrones, the one you lost and the one that enslaved you. Every story here turns on betrayal. Not betrayal by the Vikings alone, but by the kingdoms that failed to protect these women. Fathers who surrendered, brothers who fled, priests who sold them for silver. In the silence of captivity, the truth grew unbearable. Crowns could vanish in an instant, and loyalty often dissolved faster than fire on thatched dot. And yet, betrayal cut both ways. There are hints in sagas of queens who turned their captivity into leverage, aligning with Norse jarls to topple rival kings. One whispered name awed the deep-minded. A woman who outlived her Viking husband took her household west and carved her own power in Iceland. Was she a captive or a queen who learned to wield captivity as a weapon? Do you feel the tension? These women were not merely victims. They were dangerous in their silence. They carried prophecy in their wombs, vengeance in their memory, and legitimacy in their blood. To keep them alive was to risk the rise of rivals. To kill them was to risk offending the gods. And so they were trapped in a paradox too valuable to discard, too dangerous to release. If you were there, in the firelight of that hall, hearing the jarls argue, watching the queen's face unmoved as her fate hung in the air, what would you have done? Would you see her as a threat to be eliminated, or as a vessel of power to be exploited? The crown, once gleaming, now recurs in whispers. Invisible crowns passed from mother to child, crowns unacknowledged by chroniclers, crowns that later surfaced on heads of rulers who claimed descent from both Viking and captive. This is the forbidden truth. The fate of queens and princesses in Viking hands was not just tragedy, it was prophecy. A prophecy written not in ink, but in bloodlines. And every kingdom that rose in the centuries that followed bore their invisible mark. But prophecy always demands sacrifice. And in Chapter 3, we step into the rituals themselves, the blood-soaked altars, the forbidden ceremonies where noble-born women became offerings to gods, their screams swallowed by drums and fire. Picture the temple at Uppsala, Sweden, around the year 970. The chronicles describe it with awe and dread. Great wooden beams carved with serpents, gold chains glinting in the torchlight, altars stained with the blood of sacrifices. The air was thick with incense and smoke, and above the roof hung ravens, circling endlessly as though Odin himself was watching. Here, among the sacrifices of 9 animals and 9 men, rumors whisper that noble women queens, princesses, and priestesses sometimes became part of the offering. It was not merely brutality. To the Vikings, this was sacred mathematics. 9 lives for the gods, 9 gifts to renew the world. And what could be more potent than the blood of royalty? Imagine the scene. A princess, once wrapped in velvet, now bound in woolen cords, her jewels stripped, her hair unbraided to expose her humiliation. The crowd chants, drums pounding like thunder. She is not just a prisoner, she is an offering. Her lineage, her womb, her crown transformed into a gift for gods who craved not only animals but human power. Do you feel the chill? This is not a sanitized history. This is the part that was never meant to be written. Yet, not all such captives met the altar. Many queens and princesses were paraded before ritual assemblies, their fates decided not by gods, but by men in furs and iron. Some were spared, but at a terrible cost, forced marriages to jarls or kings, their titles twisted, their crowns replaced with servitude. In these marriages, survival itself became a ritual. Every child born a kind of sacrifice, binding to worlds through blood. But there are darker hints still. In the sagas, a motif returns again, and again the woman who vanishes into the mound. Archaeologists have unearthed Viking graves where women lie beside kings, their skeletons bound, their throats cut. Were they queens who followed willingly into death, or captives forced into ritual killing to accompany a husband into the afterlife? If the latter, then imagine the horror of a princess torn from her throne, only to be silenced in the dirt of a foreign grave. And yet, some resisted in ways more subtle than defiance. There are tales of queens who used rituals to whisper curses, who turned the very altars meant to silence them into weapons. Imagine a queen kneeling before the idol of Odin, her voice trembling as she pretends to accept her fate. But in her native tongue, under her breath, she curses the hall, the chieftain, the bloodline. And later, when that bloodline collapses into betrayal and fratricide, who can say the curse did not take root? The crown returns here as a ghostly image, no longer gleaming gold, but a shadow hovering over the heads of captives. Every ritual that stripped them of their earthly power only reminded the Vikings of the invisible crowns. They carried crowns that could not be burned or buried. The fear of prophecy haunted these rituals. For what if the child of a captive queen survived? What if the bloodline of a conquered kingdom rose again from within the very hall that sought to erase it? To prevent that, some women were sacrificed before they could give birth. Others were spared precisely because the prophecy demanded their survival. In every decision, terror and reverence twined together. If you were there, standing at Uppsala as the drums roared and the crowd shouted, watching a princess walk to the altar, what would you have done? Would you have turned away, pretending not to see? Or would you have stood frozen, knowing you were witnessing a ritual the scribes would never dare to record? And here lies the forbidden truth. Queens and princesses were not merely victims of conquest. They were currency in the economy of fate. Their blood spilled or preserved to feed the hunger of gods and men alike. But rituals end, and silence follows. In Chapter 4, we will leave the temples and step into the long houses, into the everyday lives of captive queens who survived not through sacrifice, but through cunning, betrayal, and the slow, dangerous work of survival. The drums have gone silent. The blood on the altar has dried. Now the story shifts inward to the longhouse. Here, beneath the carved beams and flickering firelight, queens and princesses lived in exile, far from the marble courts and jeweled chapels of their birth. Their crowns were gone, but their silence held secrets sharper than swords. Imagine the hall of a Viking jarl in Hiddeby, winter pressing against the timber walls, smoke curling toward the rafters. Warriors feast at the benches, laughter echoing with drunken pride. And there, seated by the fire, a woman with eyes that betray no fear. She was once a princess of Francia, her father a king who prayed to Rome. Now she wears wool instead of silk, her hands raw from weaving. To the men around her, she is captive, a token of conquest. But to herself, she is still a queen, and her silence is strategy. Here is where the sagas go quiet, but archaeology speaks. In Viking trading towns, graves of foreign women have been unearthed buried with both Norse and foreign ornaments. hints that they lived between worlds. Were they queens who endured long enough to weave their culture into the North? Or were they women who learned to wield captivity as power, negotiating survival with every glance and gesture? Consider the motif of weaving. In Viking culture, women at the loom were not powerless. They wove not only cloth, but fate itself, echoing the Norns who spun the destinies of gods. A captive queen at the loom was more than decoration. With each thread she wove, she was binding herself to the household, binding the household to her. Some whispered prayers into the threads. Others stitched curses hidden in patterns. A cloak woven by such hands was not merely cloth, it was prophecy disguised as warmth. Do you see how survival became weaponry? A queen in captivity did not need a sword. She needed patience, cunning, and the knowledge that time bends crowns as much as steel. But survival inside the hall was not without betrayal. The sagas tell of women who turned against their captors, poisoning mead or whispering alliances to rival clans. Yet betrayal could go both ways. A queen promised safety might wake to find herself sold to another jarl, or worse, cast onto a ship bound for lands she would never see again. In these betrayals, the invisible crown pressed heavier on their heads, a reminder of what they had lost and what they might still claim. Picture a queen teaching her son in secret. By day, he runs with Viking boys, learning the axe and shield. By night, she whispers her native tongue into his ear, teaching him the names of kings, the prayers of saints, the legacy of his mother's bloodline. This child becomes prophecy incarnate, boy raised Viking, yet carrying within him the memory of another throne. Can you feel the tension? The longhouse fire burns bright, but beneath it simmers a legacy too dangerous to be spoken aloud. And then ambition surfaces. Some queens did more than endure. They bent captivity into power, awed the deep-minded. A noble woman remembered in the sagas lost her husband but not her will. She took her household west, across seas, carving her own kingdom in Iceland. Was she once a captive? Perhaps. Was she a queen in exile? Undoubtedly. Her story reveals the possibility that captivity could be reshaped into command, silence transformed into speech, survival into sovereignty. The crown returns again, this time as a shadow in the firelight. Not on the head, not in the treasury, but in the imagination. Every captive queen carried her crown invisibly, waiting for the moment to pass it on, whether to a child, a curse, or a legacy written in silence. If you had sat in that longhouse, listening to the laughter of warriors, watching the queen's stillness by the fire, what would you have done? Would you have seen her as powerless, or would you have recognized the storm hidden in her silence? But silence does not last forever. In Chapter 5, survival gives way to conflict. Queens who endured captivity found themselves at the center of betrayals, wars, and uprisings that reshaped kingdoms. Their invisible crowns became weapons, and their children became rivals to the very men who once enslaved them. The longhouse had always been a stage of silence, whispers stitched into cloth, legacies murmured into children's ears. But history does not permit silence forever. In the Viking world, survival was only the first act. The second was betrayal. Picture the year 878, after the Battle of Edington, when Alfred of Wessex struck his great blow against the Viking warlord Guthrum. The chronicles celebrate Alfred as the savior of England, but behind that triumph lie the stories that were never written. Among Guthrum's camp were women of noble births, some captives, some queens bound by uneasy marriages, their lives suspended between conquest and survival. When the Viking army faltered, whose voices whispered of betrayal, whose hands opened the gates, whose messages crossed the enemy lines. The sagas speak in hints. Betrayal is a recurring shadow-poisoned mead. Alliances traded in the dark. Queens who turned captivity into strategy. A princess who seemed silent by the fire might, with a single glance, set rival jarls against each other. And here lies the paradox. The very women stripped of crowns learned to wield invisible power that no man could measure until it was too late. Consider Aud the deep-minded once more. Widowed, exiled, she led her household across seas, carving settlements in the Hebrides and Iceland. She was not a footnote, she was a founder. Imagine the strength required to hold power in a foreign land, to guide men who once called her a captive. Was she betraying her husband's people, or fulfilling her own destiny? The motif of the crown returns here, sharper than ever. The crown in exile, the crown that bends but never breaks. Queens in Viking hands passed these invisible crowns to their children, and soon those children became rivals, not only to the kingdoms their mothers lost, but to the very Vikings who had enslaved them in Ireland. Norse Gaelic dynasties rose, bloodlines tangled between Viking jarls and Irish queens. In Scotland and the Isles, half Norse, half Gaelic lords ruled their mothers' crowns, echoing through their claims. Every marriage, every captivity, every whispered betrayal had consequences that stretched across centuries. But betrayal was not only political. In the halls, jealousy festered. Viking wives and concubines looked upon the captive queens with suspicion, knowing that a single foreign princess could alter inheritance, shift loyalties, or breed rivals to their own sons. How many feasts ended with poison in the mead? How many children carried both prophecy and peril in their blood? Imagine this scene, a feast in York, torches blazing, warriors laughing as horns of mead pass hand to hand. At the high seat sits a jarl, his new bride a princess, once taken from across the sea beside him. She smiles faintly, her hands folded in her lap. Yet, in the shadows, a rival woman pours a cup, her eyes glinting with malice. The mead is handed across, and within hours the jarl is writhing, dead. Was it jealousy? Was it vengeance? Or was it the princess herself, using silence as cover for a strike so deadly that history could only record it as fate? If you were there, watching that smile in the firelight, hearing the cheer of men oblivious to the venom at work, would you have trusted her? Or would you have feared her more than the axe at your throat? Betrayal became the queen's weapon, but legacy was her true revenge. Every child born of these unions was a living paradox, half captive, half conqueror. These children, raised in halls heavy with smoke and prophecy, became bridges between worlds. And some of them, forgotten by chronicles, ignored by sagas, became rulers who reshaped kingdoms. Do you see how the story twists? The Vikings sought to erase queens and princesses by stripping their crowns. Yet those same women, through survival and betrayal, reshaped dynasties from within. Their invisible crowns became the sharpest blades. In Chapter 6, the final chapter, we will step into the legacy itself, the bloodlines, the myths, and the haunting silence that followed. For what happened to these queens and princesses did not end in captivity. Their story still lives in the blood of Europe today. History has a way of pretending to be complete. Chronicles boast of battles won, kingdoms forged, treaties sealed. But if you look closely, you see the gaps, the silences that betray what was deliberately erased. And in those silences dwell the queens and princesses who fell into Viking hands. Their names forgotten, their crowns stolen, their stories buried. Yet their legacy, it is everywhere. Picture a scribe in a cold stone monastery, quill trembling as he writes of Alfred the Great, of Charles the Bald, of Harold Fairhair. His ink flows in straight lines, tracing kings and victories. But notice what he does not write: the fate of the women taken when the halls burned. Because to admit their stories would mean admitting that the conquerors did not simply win with the sword. They won through the womb, through bloodlines, through dynasties shaped by captives. The DNA of Europe whispers louder than ink. Modern studies of Iceland, the Orkneys, and the British Isles show maternal lines foreign to Scandinavia, lines from Ireland, Francia, the Slavic lands. These are the bloodlines of queens and princesses carried away, sometimes in chains, sometimes in uneasy marriages. The chronicles erased them, but the blood remembers. Imagine one such legacy: a Frankish princess, her father slain, carried north to a hall in Jutland. She bears a son half Frankish, half Norse. That son grows to command ships, to carve new settlements on foreign shores. Generations later, his descendants sit in thrones across the isles. In the annals, he is remembered as a Viking lord. But who gave him his bloodline? A princess whose name was erased. Without her, his kingdom never exists. Do you feel the weight of that irony? The invisible crown passes silently, yet it outlasts kingdoms. This is the forbidden truth. Queens and princesses in Viking hands were erased from the page, but not from history. Their survival, their suffering, their cunning shaped dynasties in ways no sword could. And their silence was not weakness, it was prophecy. But there is another shadow. Not every legacy was royal. Some women died in ritual, their bones buried in mounds, beside men who were never their husbands. Some were sacrificed, their blood spilled to appease gods. Their stories end in silence, but even silence echoes. Each grave uncovered by archaeologists, each brooch or necklace unearthed beside Norse artifacts, speaks the truth the chronicles would not. These women were there. Their presence is undeniable. Their absence in the written word is deliberate. If you were standing in one of those mounds, brushing the dirt away from a skull crowned with faded jewels, what would you feel? Pity, horror, or awe? The recurring crown motif returns here for the final time. No longer gold, no longer jeweled. It is the crown of memory, the crown of bloodlines, the crown invisible yet unbreakable. Queens and princesses, stripped of everything, still passed down crowns that reshaped history. Their children ruled, their bloodlines endured, their names became myths, and in that way they won. So what really happened to queens and princesses in Viking hands? They were enslaved, sacrificed, silenced, but they were also survivors, mothers of dynasties, wielders of prophecy. They became the foundation of kingdoms that never acknowledged them. Their suffering was erased, but their legacy lives in every corner of Europe, and that is why this story matters today. Because history is not just the story of kings and warriors. It is also the story of silenced queens, forgotten princesses, and invisible crowns. To tell their story is to make history whole again. Now the silence is broken.